In a universe that almost is, just out of reach beyond the edge of reality, mysterious forces underlie the fabric of existence. Energematrice6, the very energy of creation, serves as both the elixir of life and the arsenal of destruction for its human and not-so-human denizens.
Crushing darkness, whose source they cannot fathom, grips the cosmos and its people. In anguish, they dream of the long-foretold bright star.
Join us as we embark on an epic journey, exploring the universe of Energematrice6.
And we are actually live this time. And thank you, everybody, for being here. This is episode 22 of the Energematrice6 podcast. And today we have Mel, who's going to be reading two different characters. We have Elijah, who's actually narrating for me today. And Luke's reading Andrew. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Elijah, you're still good to go, right? We're starting a few minutes late.
Yep, I'm good.
Awesome. All right, well, in that case, let me hit the V for VAD, and we will get started. The Energematrice6 podcast operates on a value-for-value model. That means that we hope if we provide some value to you in your life, that you'll return that to us in whatever way you can manage. If you're interested, head over to e6universe.com and sign up for our email list to get our free ebooks and hopefully buy a physical book or some merch while you're there. Or if all you can manage right now is to leave us a good review somewhere, 5 stars or some kind of positive rating, that's more than appreciated. Thank you. All right. Today we are reading The Boy from the Darkness. During the time of the Bright Star, at the height of the conflict, a strange new presence arrived in the Aurora Galaxy. Tom Neelian's fame would never rival that of the Bright Star, but he played a role that would dramatically change the course of history. His alliance with the Odds who followed Nate Brightstar would eventually become the stuff of legend. This is The Boy from the Darkness in year 2222 NST, The Void, Aurora Galaxy. Take it away, Elijah.
All right. Tom Neelian had an echo dancing on his last nerve. The thought made him smile sourly, even though it was almost literally true. The ancestor spirits had refused to leave him alone for weeks, even for a moment. They strained to possess his consciousness, and while his resolve and rejection of them had never slackened, their incessant whispers disturbed his calm. They kept him from thinking clearly. But they were his ancestors, and he couldn't rid himself of them. There was little he could do but push forward toward his goal, despite them. His strange odyssey had finally brought him to what he hoped would be the end of his self-imposed quest. He finally stood on the soil of Eteria, the planet of the Telestics, who had been the enemy of his people since before their history was recorded. Their conflict stretched back to an entirely different galaxy, and a time the Telestics themselves had now forgotten. Tom's bemusement and a sense of surreal disconnection from his surroundings carried him from the spaceport into the city proper, then onward toward the spires of the Telestry. The fact that he was alone here left him feeling naked and vulnerable, but so far as it seemed his ancient enemies didn't even know who or what he was. There was no disguising his stature or his face. Some tribes of the people might pass for human if they tried, if their pride would allow such a degradation. Tom's long, sensitive ears and pronounced snout-like nose and jaw made such a task impossible for him. His pupilless electric blue eyes, far larger for his face than the humans were in theirs, would have been difficult to disguise as well. The fine fur covering his face and neck put the capstone on a noble visage that was closer to an animal's than one of his distant human cousins. Even his flesh, composed of crystalline matrix, was different from that of the humans. All that aside, Even making an attempt to appear human would have been a dishonor upon the people, so he simply forged ahead, ignoring the open stares and occasional flickers of fear in the eyes of passers-by. It was reminiscent of what had happened in Bounty City, though in that instance the shock of being dropped into a world so unlike anything he had ever known was so strong he had acted unwisely. Now he'd had a little time to get accustomed to this strange galaxy, a galaxy dominated by humans who lived freely and openly, where neither the changed nor the people nor any other denizen of the dream would molest them. He still didn't really understand how such a state was possible. How could these humans still be safe? Was it simple distance? Could those who walked in the dream not know of this place? Or was there more to it? He could still touch the dream here, so he knew it had to be accessible to them, though it was different, brighter, somehow. Tom was caught mid-thought as a colorful creature covered in something that wasn't quite fur passed in front of him, diving through the air. Tom reflexively reached out, grabbed at the thing as it soared away, disappearing behind a tree. He caught nothing except a single piece of the creature's body covering. Tom had never seen anything quite like the long, flat brush, with its delicate, brightly colored design. He had spent so little time on planets that he didn't even know what to call the winged, fluffy creature. Its beauty was remarkable, as was the rest of the world. Nothing he had known before had prepared him for the azure of the sky above, or the radiant green of the leaves that rustled in the wind as he passed. These humans had no idea how extraordinarily blessed their lives were to exist in such a place. The architecture was beautiful as well. The spires surrounding Tom and to either side were graceful, yet solid and ancient. Tom's musings ended abruptly when he found himself in front of gates seemingly made of light, set in a wall that stretched practically as far as he could see in both directions. His view of the wall's length would have been blocked if he didn't naturally see the energy of life that infused it, even through the buildings that rose before it to either side of him. Tom stepped closer to the gates, marveling. The complexity of the energy that wove through them was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Even Megalith hadn't come close to the workmanship of this ward surrounding the telestry. Tom was tempted to simply absorb the energy and punch through the gate, as was the people's way. But what a shame it would be. Destroying such a work of art would be a crime. Instead, Tom stopped to consider the barrier carefully, looking for another way through. He followed the individual strands of the weave, trying to puzzle out what each was intended to do. It quickly became impossible, but in trying, Tom saw something else that sent a chill up his spine. Tiny, hair-thin filaments of power ran down from the wall of energy into the ground beneath him. It ran far, far beneath him, and when he finally reached its termination, he withdrew his perception to stare at the shining edifice, thankful that he hadn't triggered that particular trap. It was a clever ruse. If he had simply begun to draw power out of the wall, it would have worked. The life energy that flowed through the wall also supported the ground beneath his feet. If he had been foolish enough to disrupt those flows, he would have opened a well all the way down to where the world was molten, creating an explosive volcanic eruption, consuming himself and everything around him, except, of course, the gate itself. It was almost as if the profound beauty of the architecture surrounding him was designed to draw attention away from the deceptively boring ground beneath. Tom chuckled darkly, his respect for the humans of this telestry ratcheting up several more notches. Then he sank down to the pavement before the telestry, allowing his focus to flow more fully into his examination of the wall and its so far impassable gate. Tom became so engrossed in his task that time escaped him, flowing past like water down a drain. When the gate swung open, it wasn't due to any action of his. Instead, it simply opened, pulling Tom from the near-fugue state he'd sunk into and bringing him to full alert. The planet had rotated significantly, he found, and the system's star was no longer directly above him, instead hugging the horizon in preparation for the time of darkness. He must have been there for hours. The only real surprise was that in that whole time no one had come through the gate and woken him. For a long moment, Tom hesitated, staring through the opening. Gates, and especially this gate, did not simply open of their own accord. Still, this was why he'd come. Pushing his wariness aside, Tom stepped forward through the gate and began walking once more. The scenery inside the walls of the telestry was much the same as outside. The same buildings and trees, though the spires inside were already taller than those without. Tom's awareness of his surroundings never slackened as he walked, but he couldn't help but focus his attention on the sky. It was so different here, on the surface of the planet. The stars were faint and dim, all except one that was, he thought, not really a star at all. It seemed red to him, as if evil emanated from it, staining the sky around it with a ruddy haze. In the part of his awareness that extended into the dream, Tom could see that there was something very wrong with that crimson point of light. But before he could ponder further, his full attention was pulled back to the path before him. Directly ahead, the path Tom was following branched, with forks to both the left and the right, and he smiled to himself. A group of humans was waiting for him around that corner, both corners. He could see their distinctive swirls of energy through the walls of the buildings to either side, even though the walls, too, were fortified with the energy. Tom growled deep in his throat and felt his blood heat. Ambush. Setting his jaw, he took a firm hold on the instinct that urged him to jump forward into the intersection and rip the energy from every one of those waiting figures. Recklessness had cost him enough. He gritted his teeth and looked longingly ahead for a moment. He'd hoped he would be able to see the plaza at the center of this magnificent place. It rivaled even the great works of the old ones, the first of the people in its majesty. Tom stopped in front of the intersection, just beyond the reach of those who awaited him. The Iku swirled and screamed their whispers in his ears, more agitated than he'd seen them since the Bright One. Tom smiled grimly to himself and waited for his ambushers in turn, curious to see what these feral humans would do when they encountered one of the people. It took several minutes before the first human cautiously poked his head around the corner, saw Tom, and jerked it back. There followed a whispered conference that Tom could hear even over the continued harassment from the Iku. Still ignoring the incorporeal beings and trying to hear the humans' whispers, Tom couldn't help smiling ironically to himself. The strength of the Telestic's Energematrice6 shields ranged from moderate to pathetic, contemptible even. None were even close to the strength of Tom's own shield. If he actually wanted to harm these humans, they would have been dead before they knew he was there. That could still happen, of course, but it wasn't what he'd come for. A moment later, both groups of humans slowly began to emerge into the intersection from the branching paths to either side to stand before him. It took a few breaths for one to reluctantly step forward to stand in front of the others, sternly staring up into Tom's face.
"What do you want with us, vampire?"
Her face was stoic, her words crisp, but Tom could smell the fear rolling off of her. Tom nodded to her. He had no particular respect for humans, even those of a telestry, but neither did he have any desire to provoke them. He had come with a question, not to fight. So he simply shrugged and asked her, "Where is the Bright One? I have come to speak with he who was sent by the Lightmaker." The group's reactions to Tom's question varied dramatically. The woman before him never wavered, nor, he noticed, did the fear smell abate. If anything, it thickened. What could that mean? Her answer, too, was as firm and crisp as before.
"There is none such among us, vampire. We cannot help you."
It was what some of the other Telestics did that made Tom's eyes narrow. When Tom mentioned the Bright One, a few of them reflexively looked up to the sky for a moment, at the tiny red not star he had been contemplating earlier. It was only a flicker before their gazes returned to him, but enough of them showed the exact same response to leave Tom with little doubt of its meaning. Something was bothering him, however. The Iku's screeches and jabbers had faded too much. They were positively subdued. Something was wrong. Tom studied the speaker, his anger rising once more. She knew something. Again, he gritted his teeth and resettled his grip on his temper. Yet you know where he is. That is plain. Why would you not tell me? Again, her answer made his anger spike.
Brightstar has enough trouble, Vampire. I would not send him more.
Tom allowed a note of warning to creep into his tone. I wish him no ill, human of the Telestry. However, I must see him. You will tell me where he is. If these Telestics wished to test him, they would find him ready for a fight. It might even appease the Iku for a time. He flexed his arm and widened his stance in preparation to move. The Iku gabbled in excitement and, unbidden, the memory of her face swam into his vision, and his anger was gone as if it had been cut from him with a blade. Killing humans had a cost, whatever the rest of the people thought. The Telestick shook her head and was about to answer once more when one of the others stepped forward, preempting her. The move caught Tom by surprise, but not as much as this human's aura did. That aura was black as night, as dark as abyssal void. Tom physically startled, jumping backward, something he'd seen humans do, but had never himself experienced. How could Tom have failed to notice one of the Taken? Humans inhabited by a denizen of the dream were rare and dangerous. Was this nightmare of the dream world so much stronger than the one on Bounty that it could hide itself, not just from these humans, but from one of the people? Tom focused his attention on the dream, still seeing nothing at first. His eyes snapped past the nightmare riding the man, but when he focused now, he could sense that his perception was being manipulated as his vision slid away once more. Tom tried again. When he finally saw the being, he almost cowered. It was enormous and so utterly light-consuming that seeing it darkened the dream and even the world around him until he could make out little else. Then the creature spoke, its voice coming with a curious duality, both in the physical realm through its human puppet, and in the dream where it echoed around and through him, every syllable making the crystal of his matrix quiver.
What do you wish of the bright star, Nocifer?
Tom stared at the Taken, his mind racing. He noticed with a corner of his attention that the woman who had first spoken was eyeing the Taken with annoyance. Annoyance! Humans could be so stupid. She should be groveling before this being. Apparently, Tom could be stupid too. He should have said something, anything to distract the being. Instead, he was still staring at the Taken a moment later when the nightmare calculated why he was seeking the Bright One. Correctly, it seemed. The Archon laughed at him. Tom had only seen nightmares on a few occasions, and never before an Archon, one who must be a ruler of the dream. Always before, until Bounty, it had been from a great distance, which wasn't to say a safe distance. He had never seen one amused. The human meat puppet's laughter was again echoed in the dream in a quivering symphony of dissonance, and after a moment the creature spoke once more.
Your kind aren't welcome in the Lightmaker's court, Nocifer. You were conceived in darkness just as all your kind were, millennia ago.
The being's human face, obviously no more than a ghastly vessel, smirked at Tom. Tom's eyes were drawn like magnets to the burning dot in the sky above them, where he now knew the Bright One must be. He didn't seem to think so. He felt a wistful tug on his memory, along with the sinking dread that came from knowing how this encounter must end. Tom resolutely returned his gaze to the Taken, his eyes glowing blue. You and your kind belong in the dream. Who gave you leave to own this human? With his full attention fixed on the Taken, Tom was doing his own set of calculations. Nightmares were dark beings that lived within the dream. They rarely bothered themselves with the people, but for reasons Tom didn't know, were actively hostile to humans. And he was somehow certain they would be particularly hostile to the Bright One. They were always about some great task or mission, which meant this one was not here by accident. Whatever its purpose here, Tom would never be able to convince the human telestry to help him with this entity in the way. The Taken laughed again.
This one gave me everything long ago. He has become a part of myself. He wouldn't even live without me now.
The telestick shifted uneasily as Tom stared at the being, poised on a razor's edge. Whatever this human had once been, he had given himself over to the nightmare completely. If Tom could kill the human vessel, the nightmare would rebound into the dream. It might find him again someday, and this was so much more powerful than the one he'd angered in Bounty City that he could hardly believe what he was contemplating. Still, if he could kill the puppet... Again, the nightmare calculated his intent correctly. This time its laugh was malevolent.
Try me, pup.
Tom very nearly did. He was saved from his decision, at least momentarily, by a shout from behind him. Tom risked one glance backward to see a group of short figures in simple white gi running toward them. Almost instantly, he refocused his gaze on the Taken, who he was satisfied to see look genuinely shocked. Anything that could shock an Archon could also give Tom an advantage, and he needed one desperately. Tom fixed his gaze on the Taken, which was now splitting its attention between Tom and the group of humans he could hear running up behind him. They might attack, but probably not. He sensed something familiar, and his instincts were saying they wouldn't hurt him. He had no choice but to trust those instincts. The Taken was more than dangerous enough all on its own. Tom began edging towards the wall on his left, not wanting to be between these newcomers and the Telestics. He had come seeking the Bright One. Now all he wanted was to extract himself from the situation, preferably with his matrix intact. When Tom was close enough to the wall that he could see both the Taken and the human pups at the same time, he stopped and simply watched. The Taken's host hadn't moved, but within the dream its form stilled, like a predator waiting to pounce. It watched the approaching humans with an emotion Tom couldn't parse. Not fear, he thought. Uncertainty, perhaps? Tom turned more of his attention on the newcomers. He had trouble telling humans apart, even now. But what was that? One of the humans preempted his thought. A female with long brown hair frowned at Tom for a moment, then pointed right at him.
He's the one from Bounty City, Andrew.
She nodded warily in Tom's direction, and he returned her nod of acknowledgement with one of his own. The boy at the head of the group glanced over at him quickly, nodding as well.
Okay, Rachel.
Then he returned his gaze to the Telestics before them. The little group of human youths stopped in front of the Telestics, while Tom stood to one side, his eyes still fixed on the Taken. Even with his attention on that immeasurably dangerous being, Tom could feel the anger and determination radiating from the youth's leader, Andrew. The rest of the little group was split between determined and disheartened. One or two looked ready to positively tear down the spires around them. Others trailed behind their leader with heads downcast, hardly seeing their surroundings at all. It was a strange contrast, but before Tom could divine its cause, the human Telestic who had first addressed Tom stepped forward once more to meet this new group, already raising a hand for them to stop. Totally unnecessary, it seemed to Tom.
Who are you, and what business do you have in the telestry?
The one called Andrew pointed up to the tiny sparkling red dot above them and snapped back.
Bright Star's been captured, and it's your fault. You have to fix this.
He visibly swallowed and moderated his tone.
We can't handle them. We need help. Please?
The woman shook her head sharply, even as his plea hung in the air.
The telestry cannot afford to insert itself.
The Taken cut her off, contempt leaching from every pore of the host, while in the dream its substance roiled with its words.
The Telestry is our creature. It was Drake Loredan, the chief priest himself, who asked the Dominion to take custody of your precious bright star. Even now he is...
The Taken himself was cut off mid-sentence in a blur of motion. At first, Tom wasn't sure what exactly had happened. Had he blinked? No. The girl with the brown hair, Rachel, stood where the Taken had been, her eyes flashing. As Tom watched, she massaged her fist, looking satisfied. Had she punched the Taken? How had she moved so fast? Not even the people could move that fast. Despite the shocked silence, her mutter was so quiet that a human would never have heard her, as Tom did.
You don't talk about Bright Star.
Tom's gaze flickered down the lane behind the telesticks, searching, and his eyes widened. Whatever Rachel did had launched it more than 50 feet down the lane, and where it landed, the pavement was crumpled into ruin. As Tom watched, the being lifted itself clumsily out of the shattered depression its landing had created, one arm dangling strangely. Then it let out an unearthly howl.
I am the Reaper of Souls!
The substance of the dream vibrated with the Archon's anger, the dissonance between the dream and the physical clawing at Tom's brain. Rachel stared at the Taken dumbfounded, while Tom was left in shock as powerful as that which had taken him in Bounty City. She had punched the Taken of an Archon. How could she do such a thing? How could she have the power to do such a thing without even knowing what she was doing? Could even one so powerful as she not even see an Archon? The Taken was actually levitating into the air in its fury as it pointed one bone-white finger at Rachel.
I am the maker of Matrix!
Tom's own Matrix quivered, forcing him to grit his teeth against the vibration of the dream as the Archon howled. The Archon began to suck in power from both the dream and the world around, like a black hole drawing in every bit of light it could reach. The brilliance formed a dawn-like halo around the nightmare, and the Archon's shadowy shape finally became clear. The Archon looked like Tom, with something between horror and awe dawning within him. Tom realized who and what this creature must be. It was the Reaper, progenitor of the people. Perhaps not all of the people, but of Tom's own people, certainly. In all the legends of the people, there was no Archon more powerful than the Reaper. None could challenge it outright, and even the Lightmaker himself had once given it a place of honor, long, long before. The Taken, of course, hadn't paused to give respect to Tom's epiphany.
A human has the temerity to attack me?
Its head was thrown back, and Tom could tell a tremendous wave of power was gathering within the Archon's core. It was like tasting ozone in the air before electricity jumped, fulfilling its potential. But, once again, Reaper's word was chopped off as if with a knife. Focused as he was, Tom saw the streak as Rachel's dark hair streamed behind her in her near teleportation forward. With its head thrown back, Reaper had missed it, and the crack of her fist hitting it directly in the jaw was shockingly loud. This time, though, Reaper didn't just collapse. It was still thrown backward as before, but the energy that had gathered within it exploded. The power ripped outward, throwing Rachel backward as well and knocking several of the telestics completely off their feet. One of the weaker telestic shields flickered out, and the buildings around them tremored like a bell struck by a colossal hammer. Tom cowered. Just looking at the Archon, he could see that the human anchoring it to this world still wasn't dead, though Rachel's blow should have crushed any mortal skull to powder. Indeed, as Tom watched from the shadow of the wall, shell-shocked and bewildered, it rose once more. The girl must have broken its jaw, because this time the Reaper gargled instead of speaking. The fact that its words in the dream were hardly more coherent than what its meat puppet uttered didn't even tempt Tom to laugh. The specter of its wrath was so terrifying. Raw power roared out from the being like a gale-force wind, and a few of the Telestics must have either failed to shield themselves, or, as was obviously true of one man, had their shields ripped away by the initial blast, because the power that streamed across them began to strip flesh from their bones as Tom watched. He felt the strain on his own shield, still tolerable but increasing as the seconds passed. The youths in white were completely unaffected. Even Rachel had managed to maintain her shield when the blast hit her, though it had knocked her flying. Tom saw Andrew step forward with a quiet epithet as he saw what the radiating power was doing to the Telestics. The human boy extended his own shield to cover them, too late for the two who had been unshielded, but fortunately for two of the others, who immediately collapsed. Tom could tell the human boy was still hardly exerting himself, only looking annoyed. The buildings around them, on the other hand, were taking a beating as cracks formed in their surfaces and the underlying energy that held them aloft was flayed away to be sucked into the Reaper's matrix. Tom could see telltale energy patterns disappearing into the crystalline flesh the Archon had somehow grown inside its human host. Tom winced at the sheer volume of energy streaming from Reaper to rip the power from its surroundings and return it in a great howling arc to its center. How much energy must it carry within its matrix for this to be possible? Even as he watched, Reaper reached out toward the girl who had struck it, now sprawled on the ground several paces away, and clenched its fist, obviously attempting to draw her life energy from her by main force. It might have worked if the other youths hadn't stepped forward and joined their shields to hers. Was that possible? Tom shook his head, bewildered once more, as Reaper's attempt to drain her succeeded only in glutting even the Archon's insatiable matrix. The Archon drew in enough energy in the space of an eye blink that if Tom were in his place, his own matrix would have overloaded in a catastrophic explosion. Andrew's lips tightened and he shook his head.
I don't know what you are, but if you know anything of what has happened to Brightstar...
Once more, the sheer substance and volume of Reaper's howl cut him off, and its assault renewed, this time battering at the little group's shield like the impact of a kinetic energy weapon striking them from orbit. The walls around them splintered and crumbled, their masonry and alloy crumpling back from the blow as Reaper tried to crush the insignificant human specks that had dared defy it. Tom still cowered by the wall, unspeakably grateful that he had been interrupted before he could attempt to destroy Reaper's human anchor. He wouldn't be able to withstand even a fraction of that power. The human youths barely seemed fazed, though the ones that had been downcast or self-absorbed had perked up. Tom caught Andrew glancing at him, giving him a half-smirk, expanding his own shield once again to cover Tom, barely in time. Reaper's next attack was unspeakable in its violence. It was as if darkness incarnate reached out of the ground, forming into a tremendous fist to hammer them into oblivion. In the midst of the shield, two of the older boys looked at each other and nodded, then stepped forward. Their own riposte to Reaper's attack was just as powerful, stabbing out of their shield to pierce the Archon with the primordial energy of the universe. It had no effect. Whether Reaper absorbed the blow or simply phased past it, Tom couldn't tell. In that moment, however, he knew what had to be done. Reaper's anchor must be destroyed, even at the cost of the entire telestry around them. "Destroy his vessel!" Tom called from lungs that felt raw and flayed. Then he shut himself away from both the dream and the world around him, searching his core for the strength to do what he knew he must. Around him the battle continued, with the youths doing everything possible to defeat the immortal Archon. Tom ignored it. He fell to his hands and knees, reaching down into the dirt toward the threads of power that secured the very ground on which they stood. He had sensed those threads what felt like a week ago, when he stood before the telestry gate. All he had to do was break enough of them. Tom consumed the energy that had held the earth stable, trying to break the bonds and release the pent-up volcanic wrath. He was succeeding. He was almost there. Then, distantly, he heard a bellow like a wounded bull, and something crushed his perceptions. It was like getting caught with his hand in an amphora. Reaper had seen his attempt to destroy the stability of the land beneath the telestry, and now, like fingers extended into a metaphorical jar, Tom's being had poked out from under the shield Andrew had extended around him. Reaper caught his mental hand and tried to crush him, eliciting pain the likes of which Tom had only felt once before. Then the Archon pulled. It was as if the hand of a god was trying to remove his spirit from his body by brute force. No, that's exactly what was happening. Tom cursed himself for his blindness. Reaper was the source of the people's ability to siphon energy from humans, but in the Archon it wasn't just an ability to gather energy. He was ripping away the essence of Tom's very soul. Tom had been near to death more than once, but this was unlike anything he'd experienced before. He felt like he was simultaneously being pulled through a tiny hole and his self was ripping out of his body. It was both unbearable and inescapable, and it seemed to last an eternity. When the end finally came, with a mind-jarring snap, at first Tom was certain he must be dead. Instead, Tom found he could still see, though his mind felt warped and twisted, and he wasn't really sure what he was seeing. A tall telestick, tall for a human, stood above something on the ground. She stared down at whatever it was with something between contempt and fury, looking around at the destruction that surrounded them. It was the telestick woman who had first spoken to Tom. There was a molten glow off to one side. Tom could only guess he had partially succeeded in his aim to bring the planet's core to the surface. More obviously, the bases of the towers immediately around them were reduced to ruined shards. Their tops somehow, impossibly, hung by the bridges that connected them to their neighbors. The destruction was as surreal as the telestry's beauty still surrounding it. After a moment, the telestick said,
Stratigrave Rectus was always a slime mold. He should have died 100 years ago. I guess now we know why he didn't.
Tom would have sworn she spat on. Was that the corpse of Reaper's anchor? Andrew laughed grimly.
So I hope that at least changes your answer. We need your help, Telestic.
The woman sniffed.
My name is Melindra Malleus, and you have no idea what you're asking. The Bright Star has been taken to Polestar Station, the seat of the Dominion. The Telestry's hands are tied.
Rachel laughed grimly, derisively.
We'd hate to inconvenience you. It's only the Bright Star's life we're talking about. You're right that you don't have a choice, but you're wrong about the way this has to end.
The woman was still completely unfazed, her tone iron-hard.
Even I don't have the power to move the Telestry to the Bright Star's aid. Only Drake Loridan could make that decision, and he's already made another.
Another of the human youths, a girl, started to interrupt, but Malleus raised her hand commandingly and drove over the interruption.
Unfortunately, the Council agrees with our Chief Counselor. Without their support, I can do nothing except leave the Telestry myself.
Andrew's reply was obviously desperate.
Then you can help us, even if the Telestry won't?
Malleus's laugh was hammered steel.
Alone? My strength is far less than even one of you, child. What do you want from me? Our deceased friend, Rectus, wasn't wrong. The Telestry is their creature. I should have left long ago, before.
Without finishing the sentence, she turned to go, the other telesticks trailing behind her. She paused only to call back to them.
You should find your own way out, Odds. As of this moment, I have no power to extend you hospitality.
The extraordinary group of youths, for whom power seemed no object, stared after the retreating telestick for a long time while Tom regathered himself. When he was able to stand again, he looked around once, then turned his gaze to the heavens from whose depths he had come in hopes of finding a savior. There, in the sky above, pulsed the red bead of light that Tom now knew was called Polestar. Tom's close encounter with the Reaper now gave him a new insight into the source of the red haze that seemed to engulf Polestar. It was the presence of unimaginable power and darkness, concentrated so heavily that it leached out, staining the dream red. Whatever force was present there, it must be 1,000 times stronger than the Reaper, 1,000,000 times stronger. He stared out at the glowing speck for a long time without speaking, then threw back his head and let out a howl so loud and keening that a few of the humans clapped their hands over their ears. His grief and despair offered to the night, Tom stood still again, simply staring at the ugly speck of brilliance. "It is too late, then," he said softly. "The Bright One has gone to the seat of the Star Killers." Finally, he turned his head and looked down, giving each of the youths in turn a long look. No one answered. Tom bowed his head, deep pain and sorrow blossoming once more in his core. "Then we are lost." In the blackness above, Polestar Station looked like nothing so much as the red eye of a far-off dragon, glaring unblinkingly down at them through the void.
The Energematrice6 podcast is made possible by North Arrow Coffee. North Arrow Coffee is the pro-life coffee company where 15% of every purchase goes to support organizations like Crisis Pregnancy Centers, whose purpose is to support women in the most difficult situation of their lives. If you're interested, head over to northarrowcoffee.co and use promo code E6 to get 10% off with your order.
The advertisements featured did not necessarily represent my endorsements or views.
Nice job, man. You did a really good job reading that.
Yeah. Some of the phrasing tricks my brain, and I think it's going to go one direction, and I'm not reading fast enough to correct it before it comes out.
No, you're good, actually. You made about the same number of mistakes I would. Anyway, I know you probably got to go, so thank you for being here.
I can stick around for a little bit. I appreciate that.
We don't need much longer anyway. I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you, Elijah. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Mel. I know, Luke, you didn't have a lot of lines, but I sure appreciate you showing up for them. And Mel, I don't know if you realize this, but you know Melindra Malleus is the proctor, right?
I was wondering that, and I wasn't sure if that's who that was going to be, and I was like, I didn't do the voice the same.
You know
I
what?
realized
It's okay.
it about halfway through. I was like, I bet that's the proctor. I was like, oops.
She is very much the proctor, but you know
Okay.
what? That's cool. Either way, guys, you did a great job. I really appreciate it. I mostly got to listen, and I really enjoyed it. So, awesome job. And Elijah and Mel, I think next week I need both of you guys, so we will hopefully see both of you next week. And Luke, I will catch you in a couple of weeks. And thank you, everybody. Thank you,
All right.
all of our listeners as well. We'll catch you next time.